Welcome to Voices from Asia, a 4-part podcast series by the National University of Singapore. This series aims to shed light on key issues that are expected to be discussed at the COP28’s Climate Change Conference in Dubai this December, and what they mean for people in Asia. My name is Audrey Tan, and I am the Science Communications Lead at the NUS Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. In this episode, I will be speaking to Ms. Melissa Low, my colleague at the Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions, on the first Global Stocktake, which is expected to conclude at this year's COP. Thanks for joining us, Melissa.
It's great to be here.
So Mel, before we get into the weeds of today's discussion, let's start with the basics. What exactly is the Global Stocktake?
So the Global Stocktake was established under Article 14 of the Paris Agreement. And as the name suggests, the Global Stocktake is an inventory-taking process for countries and stakeholders to see where all of the countries are collectively making progress towards meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and of course, where they are not making progress. So essentially, the Global Stocktake is an opportunity for course correction. And to recap, the Paris Agreement was adopted back in December 2015. A key feature of the agreement is actually the setting of climate targets, and we know this as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs for short. And these NDCs need to be reviewed and made more ambitious every 5 years. And the Global Stocktake therefore exists to provide countries a look at what they have done so far, where we are currently at collectively, and it will also help us to look forward and lay the foundations for all countries to update and enhance their NDCs or climate targets, and they have to do so in 2025. One thing that's really important to note is that the Global Stocktake is a country-driven process. Right, so countries are the main negotiators at these COP negotiations, Conference of Party negotiations. But the Global Stocktake allows the participation of other stakeholders like cities, businesses, civil society, and others. The Stocktake is done in a really transparent manner and so far has been very open. In fact, the National University of Singapore was at COP27 last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the director of our centre, Professor Koh Lian Pin, had participated in the consultations at this meeting. And the Global Stocktake was going through its technical dialogue phase, and the meetings were conducted in a World Cafe style, which is very interesting. So because it was World Cafe style, they didn't record the sessions, but there were dedicated note takers to capture the results of the discussions. And these discussions then serve to inform roundtables, and they are included eventually in summary reports.
So it must be quite a lengthy process if so many people are being consulted for this.
Yes, the GST has been going on for about 2 years now. It started with the data collection phase in 2021, around the time of COP26 in Glasgow in the United Kingdom, all the way until March of this year, March 2023. And there was also a technical assessment phase which started mid-2020 and concluded the middle of this year. The data collection phase is where the latest scientific findings, country reports such as national communications or biennial update reports, synthesis reports of latest NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and climate finance are consolidated and compiled. The technical phase is after this step where a series of in-person dialogues begin. And what the technical phase will do is to go over these collected documents. And after this entire process, or during this entire process, a synthesis report was scheduled to be released. And this was actually released on the 8th of September, so very recently. So it's called the Synthesis Report on the Technical Dialogue for the first Global Stocktake. And the report is really significant because it provides a comprehensive assessment of collective progress towards achieving the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And get this, it represents over 170,000 pages of submissions that were made over the last 2 years. So it's a really important document because it serves as a factual resource for countries to finalize their decision at COP28 in Dubai later this year. And if you're very worried, actually, don't worry. It's only like 40-something pages, right? The synthesis report is a synthesis after all. What it does is it identifies key areas for further action and how countries can work together in order to move forward.
Thanks, Mel. So can you share with us some of the top findings from that report?
So the first key finding was that since the Paris Agreement's adoption back in 2015, this treaty has driven near universal climate action by setting goals, which are the NDCs. And this series of setting NDCs sends signals to the world on how urgent the climate crisis is. But what the report tells us is that more action is needed now on all fronts, not just governments that need to set targets. The second top finding is that credible, accountable, and transparent actions are needed both for countries and also non-country stakeholders for widespread system transformation. Okay, so we cannot just rely on top-down governments to set targets, but we need also cities, businesses, civil society, and everyone to be involved in order for us to change the way we do things. Third, while systems transformation opens up many opportunities, we also know that rapid change can be really disruptive, right? So some of these changes could result in job losses for people who are in the traditional fossil industry, for example. And so the synthesis report does identify that inclusion and equity are key in if we want to move forward together and increase ambition in climate action and support. So overall, what the report is telling us is that more ambitious climate targets or NDCs are needed, but these NDCs also need to align with what countries themselves are doing domestically and also with their long-term low emissions development strategies so that we can all move forward to getting to net zero emissions by or around 2050.
So I did read the report, and to me, it seems like it's telling us something that we already know, right? We already know that the world is off track to averting climate catastrophe. Temperature records have been broken this year. There's been so many heat waves and climate-induced natural disasters all around the world. And also recently, the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report signaled a code red for humanity. So in this case, why is the global stocktake so important then?
Yeah, so the global stocktake is important because, as I mentioned earlier, it marks the most extensive and comprehensive assessment of global action on climate change to date, and from the most diverse of stakeholders. For comparison, you raised the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, earlier. So the IPCC looks only at published scientific papers. So these are peer-reviewed journal articles, right? So it doesn't draw from a wider range of stakeholders or publications. But the GST does, the Global Stocktake does, and it draws not only from scientists and governments, but also cities, businesses, farmers, civil society, indigenous people, marginalized people from all over the world. Over 1,000 documents were submitted over the past 2 years, and it was very clear from the beginning of the Global Stocktake that in order for the process and outcome to be really effective, to have buy-in, you really need equitable participation by all. So in ensuring an equitable process for participation, right, collecting as you go, so many documents, thousands of documents over the years, making sure that the process is transparent and open, World Cafe style, it is super necessary to make the Global Stocktake legitimate, right, in the eyes of all that are involved and who contributed to the findings and outcomes. So everybody has a stake in the outcome of the Global Stocktake. It can improve countries' and stakeholders' will and capacity to work towards a common goal and leading to enhanced ambition for and from all. The synthesis report does tell us that if we don't enhance or take stronger climate action in the next round of NDCs or nationally determined contributions and before the next global stocktake in 5 years' time, unfortunately, climate change could be irreversible. The report provides an opportunity for course correction. It gives us a path forward, and if we are serious about addressing the climate crisis, we will do more. And so the world is now watching on how the political phase of the global stocktake will play out. And this is where COP28 is going to be important, and we need to watch very closely on the final decision text of the global stocktake.
So as you mentioned earlier, the synthesis report of the 3 technical dialogues on the global stocktake was already published in September, and that concluded that more work needs to be done if we want to limit global warming, adapt to climate impacts, and provide support for developing countries. In that case, what are we expecting at COP28? You mentioned the political phase. Maybe tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. As alluded to earlier, following the data collection and technical assessment phases of the global stocktake over the past 2 years, the third and final phase of the global stocktake is the consideration of outputs at COP28 in Dubai. So country delegates that attend COP28 will discuss the global stocktake's technical findings, which are contained in this synthesis report, and they will use this to identify opportunities, challenges, and also try to find a way forward in terms of best practices and international cooperation.
Oh, so basically they are trying to see how feasible it is to implement the recommendations in the global stocktake to their own national plans?
Yes, that's right.
That's interesting. So let's bring the discussion closer to home now for us here in Asia. Based on the latest report, what are some key areas you think are especially relevant for our region and why?
That's a great question. For me, it's very clear to the world that more can be done on mitigation, that is, to reduce emissions. But the report also highlights the opportunities for adaptation across systems and sectors. As Asia, as we know, continues to be vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and we need to continue to build on good practices to adapt to specific hazards relating to climate change. Effective adaptation can come in the form of advancing ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions and multi-hazard early warning systems. And this is all in the report itself. For Asia, the systems particularly need to connect to early action so that countries and communities can respond quickly to extreme events at multiple scales. It's not just at the national level, but also at the local levels. The second key area for Asia, and this is an area that I'm sure is growing in importance for Asia, countries should be embracing submitting these transparency reports, both on mitigation but also adaptation communications. The reason for this is because reports outline experiences and national efforts on emissions reduction and how countries are actually building resilience. And the more Asia seeks to share this with the rest of the world and their counterparts in the rest of Asia, actually it helps them to highlight priorities, implementation and support needs, plans and actions, and so on. Reporting also performs a very important secondary function of policy reform. So you can check against your report and see whether you've actually made those progress that you said you're going to make, right? And furthermore, it encourages self-examination and can also empower and mobilize both government and non-government actors like civil society. So I think that transparency reporting is really crucial for Asia moving forward. And on top of that, is required under Article 13 of the Paris Agreement under the Enhanced Transparency Framework. And finally, for Asia, communicating and disseminating information from global systems to local users will be really key. And this is key to durable, transformational, and effective climate action. So we know a lot of talk is happening at the top level, right? COP meetings and so on. But we really need to find a way to facilitate conversations and work between governments at all levels, right? So keeping in mind that outside of Singapore, there are governments with multiple levels. And so we need to facilitate conversations and work between these governments with communities, civil society, educational institutions, scientific and other institutions, media, investors, businesses, indigenous and marginalized groups, so that we can all do what the GST or Global Stocktake Synthesis report is saying, and to overcome the challenges that we will face ahead, especially as the climate crisis gets more urgent.
So, what do you think a good outcome for the political process of the Global Stocktake will look like? And do you think that there are going to be any key obstacles that are going to prevent that from happening?
Yes, so the COPs are always very exciting. My expectation is that there will be a final decision to formalize the Global Stocktake guidance and commitments for all countries to adopt in developing their next nationally determined contributions in 2025. So a good outcome would be a clear conclusion that countries must use the Global Stocktake Synthesis Report findings to review and submit enhanced nationally determined contributions. And this will result in more ambitious 2030 and 2035 climate targets in 2025. We want to avoid vague conclusions or even a decision to take note of the Global Stocktake outcomes. That would be really bad.
So yeah, maybe you can just tell us a bit more about that. I kind of vaguely recall that in COP24 in Katowice, we kind of saw some developments on controversy about whether the findings of a scientific report on climate science would be welcomed or noted.
Yes, that does happen at the COP meetings. We saw that in Katowice, Poland, and subsequently in other COPs as well as also in the recent subsidiary body meetings in June this year, I believe. Whenever there is a reference to science or reference to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report for 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, often some countries will be, put it this way, they will block the negotiations, right? Or they will try to merely note the findings of these reports because these reports point to the science and it refers to very strict reduction in emissions. So the IPCC 1.5 degree report actually points to the fact that countries should pursue plans to reach net zero around mid-century, right? 2045, 2050. So I think some countries are concerned that the reference to the science will make it mandatory for them to achieve net zero. And they're concerned, of course, about poverty alleviation, about other national goals that they're trying to achieve, economic development and so on. So there tends to be a watering down of the significance of science. And seeing that the synthesis report does mention the science and the IPCC specifically, I do expect that this may be an obstacle to getting a clear and conclusive outcome for the global stocktake. And so we'll have to watch that really closely.
So other than the global stocktake, what are some other issues you think are worth watching at COP28?
Yes, so there are many other agenda items to look out for at COP28. The big one, of course, is loss and damage, right? So at COP27, countries had agreed to set up this loss and damage fund to compensate nations for losses and damages that were brought about by climate impacts. It was, of course, as we know, because we were there, it was a historic decision. However, countries had stopped short of finding sources of funding for this fund, and so it's not yet been operationalized. So at COP28, we will likely see further discussion on this issue, including who will be contributing to this fund, as well as other issues relating to funding arrangements, logistics, for example. And second, countries have to decide on whether to adopt a strong framework for the global goal on adaptation, which includes fulfilling climate financial pledges to the Adaptation Fund, Least Developed Countries Fund, and others. And so there is some expectation for doubling of adaptation finance and for multi-development banks to scale the adaptation efforts. There will be attention on whether these funds are accessible, of course, to countries that need it the most, and whether they will actually reach the community and local levels. Speaking of climate finance, we should also watch for how far countries will get to in negotiating the details for the new quantified goal on climate finance, which is not due this year, it's due only next year. But we do expect some stepping stones such as quality of funding, timelines, instruments, sources, access, and so on, right? So these provide some stepping stones for the establishment of the new quantified goal on climate finance, which is only due in 2024 next year. And of course, there are some residual negotiations on Article 6, including how to treat removals and on the infrastructure such as the international registry that will also be negotiated at this year's COP. So it's panning out to be quite an exciting climate conference in November, December this year.
Thanks so much, Mel. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today, but thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thanks for having me, Audrey.
That's a wrap for this episode of Voices from Asia. Stay tuned for subsequent episodes where we highlight more issues from COP28. What they are, how they work, and why they matter for Asia.